Hello and welcome back to How to Teach the Bible preaching class. Let's go ahead and jump back in. Previously, we talked about the sermon idea and then we discussed the division statements. Now, this section is actually under the division statement, so this is what we'll be looking at today. The explanation illustration is actually where we will be spending the bulk of our time, and then also the tie-in. This is all under the division statements, which means that we are essentially in our text, we are in our division statements. Now, the explanation, very simple. We are essentially explaining the text and what exactly is going on in the text. What does that mean? Okay, well, we have deserting the gospel. And these are not really division statements yet. These are more things I'm throwing down. We're going to go ahead and reword these a little bit later. But I just kind of threw them down for the sake of simplicity now, and we will. You know what? Actually, let's go ahead and do that now. Otherwise, we're going to forget later. So instead of just a plain random sentence fragment called deserting the gospel, um, let's just say, dude, or actually never. Instead of desert the gospel, which I keep feeling like I'm going to talk about dessert. Let's talk about abandoning the gospel. And one of the things about our division statements, and even within our sermon idea, is sometimes I like to reformulate them in less of an archaic language from the text. Maybe if you're reading from the King James version, or something like that, and more into the language of the audience, right? And so, deserting the gospel doesn't really have as much bite as much as abandoning does. It's a little bit more illustrative. It's a little bit more seared into our minds when we think about abandoning the gospel, because we might think of, an abandoned dog or abandoning a child, as terrible as that is, as dark as that is. It's seared into our minds the idea of abandoning the gospel. You would never abandon anything, let alone the gospel. So it's a very illustrative thing, and it's exactly what the term desert is, deserting the gospel is intended to communicate. I just think it does it better. Um, and so we can talk about abandoning the gospel. And so let's explain this. What does the explanation mean? Well, our explanation is explaining this. And what we'll be doing is explaining the text again. This is not talking about what it means to you. Get yourself and get the audience you're preaching to out of the text. We're moving back into the text, and we are talking about what Paul and the Galatians are going through. That's all. In the explanation, it's only about Paul and the Galatians. And so when I explain the text, we will be talking about Paul, who is sitting in prison, is astonished. I mean, his mind is blown that someone who once knew that Christ was raised could then abandon that fact for something else. And so he's saying here, I am shocked that you have abandoned or are so quickly deserting the gospel of Christ to a different gospel. There's something else here that Paul recognizes as a different gospel, something that the Galatians have allowed to seep into the church. They have allowed this different gospel, or these teachers, or someone, and this idea to seep into the church, and they have taken it on for themselves in their theology as a different gospel. And so Paul is addressing this problem to the Galatians, that they have been duped in a sense. They have understood a different gospel. They have been taught and persuaded wrongly of something that is not true regarding Christ and their salvation. And so Paul wishes to address this. That's the explanation. Notice that at no time did I bring up you, me, or anyone in the room. What I emphasized on was Paul and the Galatians. We are going back in time to get into the text and explain what is going on here in the text so that we can rightly understand the Bible, the text, which is the whole reason why we're preaching. So we are going to explain the text, and so you can write here, um, Paul in prison, shocked, and then Galatians, duped. I don't know if that's the way you spell it, but and then different gospel. And I don't know how you're going to write it. Very often when you just begin preaching, you will literally write out like a transcript, everything you want to say. In this, you will have 17 pages in explanation, and you'll go way too long on it. But I'm just putting bullet points here because I don't want a lot here to kind of show. I'm really just trying to show that there's an explanation portion here. In my own, I actually take out the explanation. I'll go ahead and show you guys one of mine in a later video. You'll see that I actually have the explanation completely taken out. But that's the explanation. We are explaining the text and what it says. All right, so now that we're done with that, and you understand what an explanation is, once we've come through and we've told people our division statement, we are going to kind of read through the passage again, and then we are going to explain the passage. And so we explain through the passage. We've told them our division statement, which is essentially our subpoint or one of our arguments for our main point, our sermon idea. But we're going to assume that people don't understand what we're saying. For every single division statement, there is the probability, I was going to say the possibility, but there's the probability that someone didn't track with you. And never assume that everyone is tracking with you. Always assume that someone is either dull or not tracking or not understanding. And so what we're going to do to help people learn, because we don't just tell them, here's what this is. We don't just give them a list of facts and then hope that they learn it. We really want them to bring it from the head to the heart. We're going to help them not only understand, but internalize that. And what's one of the ways that we can accomplish that? Not just through argumentation, which is our explanation. We're not just going to show them why it's important, but illustrations. Illustrations are so important to understanding the text. Illustrations are so important to having our ideas get, right through the barrier that is logic, thought, and even distractions. Sometimes people are not listening to your sermon because they have a lot going on at home. Something's in the back of their mind. Maybe they got into a fight on the way with their wife on the way to church. Something's on their mind. But sometimes an illustration can snap them out of that and will in itself teach them the division statement and maybe even the sermon idea. So our illustration is going to be essentially a story, statistic, quote is a good one too. A story, a statistic, a quote, physical, display. So there's a lot of different ways to do illustrations, and in fact, I can't list them all here, but I will actually bold this so you guys can see it a little bit more. Bold this and bring it to a story statistic. Now, about 80 to 90%, dare I even say that's an understatement. Most illustrations are stories. They might be personal stories, they might be made up stories, they might be famous stories of historical figures. Um, I said display. I keep typing through the smaller screen. But most illustrations are stories. And that's not to say that all your illustrations should be stories. I'm just kind of saying that that's the way I preach, and that's the way a lot of people preach. It's really easy to tell through story because stories are impactful and powerful. It could be our testimony. It could be something that we gone through. It could be just a story that happened to us the other day. It could be a story that happened to our friend the other day. It could be a story that our pastor went through that we remember. It could be a famous story. It could be a story of a historical figure. We already kind of ran through that list. But stories generally make up a lot of what our sermon illustrations are. That being said, I will say this: men, you are going to have the temptation of making every illustration about sports. Don't do that. You will have effectively shut off half of your audience by making everything about sports. Don't make it about sports. As men, try to resist using sports as your illustrations as much as possible. Not to say that they're bad. Actually, in fact, they're often very good. Sometimes they communicate what exactly we're trying to show. When it comes to loyalty, I can't think of anything else more than a football illustration on how the quarterback must rely on his defensive line. Um, and I'm already starting to lose people here. But it can really fit. But as men, we want to resist against that because for every single time we think up, oh, good sport illustration might serve here, I want you to at least remind yourself, how many of these have I done? Can I think up of another one, or is this the perfect one? And if we do that at least, then we will essentially be mitigating against that temptation. That we won't go into the territory of essentially cutting off half of our audience if it's conscious. If we make a conscious effort to try and not do that, then we're probably going to be good. And so I just wanted to tell my men to just have that in the back of their minds because we really do. We watch sports a lot and they really are fantastic illustrations. They really are. Um, but we have to resist that because not everyone watches sports, especially half of our audience. Um, so I just wanted to say that. Uh, be sure not to make everything about sports. I just saw my. We can make this a little bit bigger. Fantastic. Alrighty. I think I can take the other side in women. You guys have great illustrations. The only thing is, not everything needs to be very emotional. Testimonies are very powerful. But if you put too many testimonies or if you have a lot of illustrations about yourself, that can be bad too. Um, some things need to be just logical. Not saying that women are not logical or they're very emotional, but women are very relational. Psychology tells us this. It's a temperament of most women. Um, Men are very objective in their temperament, and women are very relational, and that's they choose jobs that correspond to that as well. It's a general trend. And so a general trend in women preaching too will be that your illustrations where men are very objective and they're going to want to go the sports realm because it's objective and you can kind of really show the trait that you're trying to illustrate. Um, Women will have the tendency to have their illustrations be very emotional and impactful in that way. And so it's going to feel like you're, for the men in the audience, like you were watching a drama or a rom-com where everything is trying to bring an emotion out of me. And we're going to try and resist that. In fact, we're going to turn our brains off to that. And so not everything needs to be an emotional appeal that strikes at the heart and just gut wrenches us. We're going to resist that. So be cautious of that as well. As women, you might want to go into sports if you know enough about sports. Um, if you don't, well then try and find a different illustration. But even as I'm trying to explain this, and this is why the illustration section will probably take the biggest portion as far as videos go. Illustrations are so important to our sermon, but at the same time, there are so many pitfalls when it comes to illustrations. Don't have every illustration be about yourself. There are two ways to go wrong here. You have illustrations always about yourself, you're essentially a narcissist that only likes to talk about yourself and the Bible. We see it. So try not to do that. In general, you can have maybe one illustration about yourself. It could be the hook, it could be one of the illustrations, but try and reserve maybe one illustration about yourself. If possible, no illustrations. I'm not saying move away from yourself, but there is a temptation because you know the most about yourself. In fact, you've lived an entire life and you have countless memories. So the temptation is to take from the biggest well spring that you have, and that is your own stories. And that's good. I mean, like I said, testimonies and your own stories are powerful. They're very relatable sometimes. So you might be tempted to use a lot of your own stories. that's that's the temptation. But you don't want to be talking about yourself a lot. And so there's one pitfall. The other pitfall within that is that each time you do talk about your own testimony, let's say that you do it once a sermon, and so you're within the range that you're not always talking about yourself, or maybe you do it every once in a while, but every single time you do, it's about how someone did you wrong and you rose up above it, or um, something happened where you made a mistake and then you came to the Lord and you rose above it. You're always the hero in your story. And that too kind of feels a little bit narcissistic because, well, you're always talking about how good you are, right? You're always talking about how you triumph over the trial, that you always make it through, and that you always become a better person. And that's why you're the upstanding person that you're preaching uh, from the front of the pulpit. That's why you're the guy, you know. Uh, and that's who gets communicated within illustrations as well. If every illustration is about how awesome you are, or how good you are, or how you never fail, or you always rise above it. So that's another thing. That's another pitfall to watch out for within illustrations about yourself. Now the reverse side, maybe you keep making mistakes. There was this one time where I thought this, and hey, I was wrong. And I've seen that as well. There are almost like a class of preachers that just think that they're the worst person and that they're just bumbling fools. And every sermon is about how they messed up and they forgot their keys and they're just a bumbling fool, but luckily their wife came in to save the day and gave them their keys. Or they were messing up and they just did this and they met and bumbling fool. And at some point we agree with you, because if everything's about how dumb you are, maybe you are dumb. and and if we agree with you, like maybe you are dumb because you always seem to fail, why am I listening to the gospel from you? I mean, you can't even remember your own keys. You can't even string together a coherent sentence. You can't even, get things right. Everyone is having to save you. Why should I be listening to you? And so that's the other end of that you're always wrong. So you need to make sure that you're aware how often you're bringing yourself into a sermon, and also what kind of light you're bringing yourself to the sermon. It's okay to fail. In fact, that makes you human. And it's also good that you overcome life obstacles. That's the whole point of our life. We continue in our life. So we overcome life obstacles, and those can be really great resources to show how we overcome that. So illustrations are great. Our own illustrations are powerful. We want to make sure that we're not using too many of ourselves in them. And when we do, we don't want to always be the hero, but we also don't want to be the bumbling fool all the time either. We want to make sure that we have a bit of both. Statistics are great, and they can serve as an illustration as well. Abandoning the gospel. The Pew Research actually says that 62% of Christians in 2010 identified themselves as evangelical evangelical Christians that believe in the gospel and go to church every week. But in 2023, the same Pew Research Center has concluded that only 23% of Christians are identified as Christians, are gospel believing, Bible believing, and go to church. That is a 40% drop. I just made that up, by the way. I'm looking at the screen on the template. I'm not looking at data. I just made that up. But you can see the statistic and the wow factor of abandoning the gospel has become a statistical illustration that people are indeed abandoning the gospel, just like the Galatians that I just took the time to explain. So that's a really good illustration for this phenomena that is my division statement. And you can see that that is a really good illustration because it has solidified in our mind the concept of abandoning the gospel that I'm trying to communicate. So that's what illustrations do. So we have a personal story, we have any type of story, even a historical story or anything like that. So maybe I don't know. Um, I did one just the other day on Caesar and his crossing the Rubicon, and that was a really good illustration for the necessity of making a decision. And that was my point at the time. That was my division statement, and so I used that as my illustration. There's a historical example. It wasn't about me, but it was a story, and I got to tell this story, and it brought about the depth of needing to make that decision, which was my division statement. It was actually my sermon idea, but it shows. It shows as an illustration or a physical. I mean, a quote's really good too. I almost just jumped over the quote. Some quotes are really great. Abandoning the gospel. C.S. Lewis has said that those people that abandon the gospel uh, are I don't know, weak Christians or something. Like it's a I can't think of a very inspirational quote off the top of my head, but quotes can be really great because very often quotes, the reason why they're preserved as quotes is because they are so effectively communicating an almost proverbial wisdom, like a short sound bite that is in literature. It's a writing. It's a short sound bite of something so profound. And so you can give this quote and then you can just leave people in a little bit of silence to kind of contemplate the depth of that. And when they really let that hit them, that not only hits them, but that proves our division statement. So quotes can be good too. The only thing I'll say about quotes, you don't want to pepper too many in with any of these, right? You don't want a whole statistical analysis every single every single sermon, and you don't want to just be quoting everyone because it almost seems like you have nothing to say. Um, so we just kind of want to switch it up. But as I said, most illustrations are stories, and people are okay with that. The final thing that you might be questioning is, what is a physical display? And this is actually something that just came to mind because I was doing a podcast on this. Physical displays are also something. They're something you probably want to not do a lot of. Otherwise, you're essentially going to be the carrot top of sermons, the physical props and stuff of um, sermons, and I don't think that's going to be a great look. But I don't know, maybe that's your thing. But a good physical display sermon illustration was Francis Chan's rope analogy. And he took this very long rope. It went all the way across this stage. It was rather large. And he talked about how long this rope was, and he's in how far it spanned. But then at the very end of the rope, he had just this very little red tape tied around the end. And he showed that to the audience. And he said, this red tape, essentially, this red tape is the amount of life you live here in your lifetime. And the rest of the rope is eternity. And so you got a visual illustration of that one little piece of tape at the very end of the rope, and then you had all of this rope just so spanning across this entire stage, this extremely large rope. And it really hits the brain because you see, wow, I have so little life by comparison in this 100 years that I'm living that's called my life, by comparison to eternity. And then he hits you with the point, are you living in a manner to affect eternity, or are you essentially living for the one piece of tape? I believe that was the point of the illustration. But it was a really great illustration, and in fact, very many preachers I've seen it a couple times actually from different preachers use the same illustration. It's a great illustration, but that's what we would call a physical display. Is the rope is physical, and a different preacher I saw, which I didn't like this one, but I thought it was a lot to invest, was he kind of brought up a bunch of ingredients and put it on top of his pulp. And there's like milk and there's mash and all this other stuff. And he said that you need all of those ingredients to make this thing. And so his idea was that I think that we all need each other. And so he's like, none of these make this item, but you need all of them to make the item. And so it was a good physical display illustration. The only thing I just didn't like about it is that he had to essentially preach the rest of his sermon with all of that sitting on his pulpit. And in fact, he had to have all of it underneath his pulpit before he got to it. So it was a lot to invest for such a small, quick illustration. But those are physical displays, and they're really good. Um, but that's just one way to illustrate your division statement. I'll probably include a bit more in the class. And one of the things that you won't get in these videos that maybe I can pepper them in the future are some insights that I have that I think up as I go along. Um, I'm trying to include as much as I can in these videos, but yeah, sort of the pitfalls of including yourself and not including yourself too much is something. And illustrations have, because they're so big and because they're so important, because they're used very often, they're also one of the things that have the biggest pitfalls. So that's something to be um, conscious of. And it's hard to think up of everything on the fly. So I can't really think up of everything to teach you in just this video. Some of this stuff is going to come up as you develop your sermons and make the mistakes that we'll be able to correct them. But that's good for now. Let's maybe think up of an illustration for abandoning the gospel. Um, abandoning the gospel. Maybe we can talk about abandoning a dog. Abandoned dog. Um, And I don't really, you know what? We'll have that as bolded now, but just so you know, this wouldn't be bolded. We'll have this as an abandoned dog, and then fake gospels will put oh, this is an explanation because I'm looking at the wrong screen. Um, we'll put counterfeit money, and then fake teachers. Maybe we'll talk about catch me if you can. And in fact, actually, as I'm thinking about fake gospels, maybe we can actually I like fake gospels and how it allows me to kind of come back in with counterfeit money. And then with fake teachers, um, that makes sense. Maybe this is good. It's very, I don't know, it seems kind of crude in its wording and kind of rough around the edges, but maybe we'll keep these as division statements. Um, so fake teachers and stuff. And then with Catch Me If You Can, I'll put con man because that's what I really want to bring. Catch Me If You Can is a movie about a con man, and he cons a lot of people. He cons the government until he finally gets caught. I don't know. I think at the end. Spoilers. It's historical, so you should know that. I actually don't even remember the movie very well, to be honest. um. Anyways, Catch Me If You Can. Yeah, it's about a con man, and he cons a lot of people, not just as one thing. I think he first starts as like a teacher, and then as something else. So he plays a lot of different roles. But it would be good to illustrate fake teachers, and the whole point is them trying to dupe you to think that they are a good teacher, and but actually they're just here to dupe you and take advantage of you. So we have three illustrations here. Fantastic. And then you might see this, the tie-in. And this is really easy to explain, just like our explanations. A tie-in is essentially a reminder that you have this weird transition, right? You've told the audience your division statement. You've explained the passage and how that's derived from the division statement. And then you've illustrated it. And it's like, wow, the counterfeit money, which is what I'm looking at right here, the counterfeit money makes so much sense with fake gospels and stuff. But we're stuck on counterfeit money because the illustration's a story. So now we're kind of standing at this cliff and you're building the road as we're going along. And we don't really know what to do with that information. We need you to bring it back, right? Where it's not about counterfeit money. It's not about an abandoned dog. It's not about catch me if you can con man. It's not about any of that. It's about the text. It's about the Bible. So we need you to tie it back into a bow for us. And so you give us the division statement, you explain the text, you illustrate the text, but you need to bring the illustration back to the text on and kind of tie it into bow by saying, just like there is counterfeit money, so too are there counterfeit gospels out there. And the Galatians are believing these counterfeit gospels, which is why I wanted to keep them. This was why I ended up wanting to keep them different, because it's a really nice tie in where we might even say counterfeit gospels. Um, so we can be like, wow, there's counterfeit gospels. All right, cool. Now that you have that, and we can transition this, and that's one thing I'll say as well. Each transition statement, transition statement, transition statement. There's going to be a lot of transitions that you need in your preaching. And if you need to write them down, do that. Have a little TS here and then have a transition statement. Just like there are counterfeit gospels. So this is actually, um, I'll just write this out because I can't talk and type at the same time. All right. So our transition sentence, once we've kind of tied it back in, we're going to now try and transition to our next division statement so it seems fluid. So it seems like our sermon is all flowing together as one thought. That's what we want it to feel like. We want it to feel like a journey, not a choppy terrain. So we're going to talk about counterfeit gospels because we tied it back into our text, which we're going to try and stay in our text as we transition to our next division statement. Just like there are counterfeit gospels, so too are there counterfeit teachers, which is our next division statement. And you don't know, you're not going to say division statement, but I'm using that for now. So that's our next division statement, that there are counterfeit teachers, there are fake teachers. And then let's look at the text, and then that's where you're back in explanation, and then you're going to illustrate it, and then you're going to tie it back in, and then you're going to, if this was the first one, you're going to transition to this one. So there's kind of a groove here that you're going to work through when you're in your division statement section. So we just explained all of that. We had the explanation, the illustration, the tie-in, and then even a transition statement. So great. That's pretty much done here for the division statement section. I know this is a little bit longer of a video, but unfortunately with illustrations there is a lot to illustrations, and some of it I still haven't included just in this video. Otherwise it would be a lot longer. So yeah, I will catch you in the next video.